Hello everyone, welcome to this video lesson based on the English Literature SPM 2206 syllabus, and this video is presented by Monty Literature. In today's video, we are going to talk about the poem Daffodils by William Wordsworth, which is one of the poems that is compulsory for you to study and to maybe answer about in the exam. So this poem is also known as I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, based on the first line, which we are going to see in a bit. But in our SPM syllabus, it's called Daffodils. So I guess maybe one question you might have is, what are daffodils? So these are daffodils. These are cute yellow flowers. And close up, they look something like this. So they're very pretty, they're quite small, and you don't find them in Malaysia, as far as I know. They are found in Europe, and in this case, particularly, they are found in England, which is where William Wordsworth grew up. William Wordsworth was a poet who lived quite some time ago, and as I said, he was in England, and he is remembered as a romantic poet. What does this mean? This does not mean that he writes about love and romance, but the term romanticism is broadly applied to a movement. So those of you who maybe play the piano or you're in the school band, you might be aware of this genre of music called classic, like sort of romantic music. Those of you who are into art might also know that there's this genre of art called romantic art. And similarly, in English literature, there's the romantic literature. And the romantic poets, they were really into nature. They loved nature, and to them, nature is not just like something that's pretty, something that you enjoy. They experienced nature and they wrote about their experiences of nature in a very personal and intuitive way. There was almost something spiritual about it, but not spiritual in the straightforward sense of going to church, following the official religion, but rather there's something deep and personal about their experiences of nature and the way they wrote about nature. And another theme that's really prominent in the works of the romantic poets is this theme of imagination, and you can see how it all ties together. And some of these themes, we're going to see a little bit of them in the poem by William Wordsworth. I think that it's really interesting how the romantic movement in art spread. You can see it across literature, writing. You can see it across paintings, across music. And one really famous painting that really encapsulates the spirit of romanticism is this painting. It's by a German painter, and it's called Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. So you can see that here's a single, person standing alone, looking out at this majestic, powerful scenery out there. And we can only see his back. We don't know what he's thinking, but there's this sense of journey, like a personal journey, something deep and individual, some sort of connection with nature that transcends the rational. And that kind of sums up a number of the themes within the writings of the romantic poets. So let's get down to the poem Daffodils by William Wordsworth. So I'm going to read the poem, and then I'm going to explain basically what it means before we get on to the themes and the literary devices and some sample questions for you to try out. So let me read this poem, and I'll explain it stanza by stanza. Okay, so stanza 1. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Okay, and that's what we would call stanza 1. Stanza 1. Okay, so what is the poet saying in this stanza? You can feel free to skip ahead if you understand it quite easily. This is for the benefit of those who maybe find the phrasing a little bit hard to understand. So okay, we know here that the poet, there's this persona, there's someone that speaking, right? And we'll call this the persona or the speaker. Okay. So this I is the main character here, and he tells us that he was wandering around, meaning walking around, and he was wandering around in a lonely way, as lonely as a cloud that floats high over the valleys and the hills. Okay, vales means valleys, so we've got the valleys in here, and then we've got the hills up here, right? So a cloud, imagine a cloud that is floating high over the valleys and the hills. All right, so this persona is comparing himself to this cloud floating around. Okay, and then all at once, suddenly I saw. Okay, so suddenly the the persona sees this crowd of golden daffodils. All right, so this is the picture that I chose because I think it really captures it so well. The poet suddenly sees a huge number of golden daffodils. Okay, so daffodils are yellow, but he uses the word golden here. And you know, that really gives the sense of something rich and beautiful. All right, so he tells us that they are beside the lake and beneath the trees. All right, so you imagine that there are some trees, there's a lake, and here are all the daffodils. Okay, and they are fluttering and dancing in the breeze. The breeze meaning there's like a wind blowing them, and you can see them moving as a result. Okay, so let's go to stanza 2. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. All right, so some of you might be wondering, what does all of this mean? So in poetry, sometimes the poets don't write in full sentences, right? That's what makes it poetry. So to help you understand, you can start this sentence this way. The daffodils were as, okay, so the daffodils were as continuous. He's describing them and saying how continuous they are, just like the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. So what is the Milky Way? The Milky Way is basically this beautiful arrangement, constellation, I'm not sure what's the correct word, but all these stars, you know, stars in the sky, one long stretch of stars that you can see. So he's comparing the daffodils to the stars. He's saying that the daffodils are like the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way in a never-ending line. But now he's talking about the daffodils. They are stretching in a line along the margin of a bay. So the bay is kind of like, it's basically the seaside, right? So that's why I chose this picture. So you just imagine they're by a bay here. So there's a long line of daffodils that are along this bay. And then the persona tells us that he saw 10,000 daffodils tossing their heads in sprightly dance, in a dance. Okay, what sprightly means? Sprightly basically means very energetic. Okay, so let's go to stanza 3. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. All right, so he's still describing the scene. Okay, so remember that the daffodils are by the seaside, right, along a bay. So there are waves, right, beside the daffodils, and he says that the waves beside the daffodils were also dancing, but the daffodils, this day refers to the daffodils, okay, but the daffodils, they outdid the waves, meaning that they performed even better than the waves. They were so gleeful, they danced so energetically that they outperformed. They were even more beautiful and vibrant than the waves. Okay, so here he's describing that basically the daffodils were even better than the waves. Okay, and then in this third line here, he tells us that a poet, referring to himself, a poet could not but be gay. So translating this into a more colloquial English, it means that someone like him cannot help himself but to feel happy, cannot help feeling happy. Okay, in such a jocund company. What does jocund mean? Jocund means like cheerful, light-hearted. Okay, so he's basically saying, I couldn't help feeling happy with such cheerful friends around me. And he's referring to the daffodils again. I gazed. Gaze is something like staring. Okay, so I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. What does this mean? He stared and he stared, but he didn't really realize that this sight had given him so much wealth. Okay, meaning it had given him so much and he didn't even realize it. Let's go to the fourth stanza. For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. Okay, let's break this down. For here means because. Okay, oft means often. Okay, so he says, in the previous stanza, he told us that he didn't realize at that time how that view, that beautiful sight, had brought to him so much that's of value, so much wealth. All right, and then he tells us why in the next stanza, why he said that. He tells us because very often when I'm lying down on my couch, like my sofa, in a vacant or pensive mood. Vacant means kind of like empty, like that kind of mood when there's nothing in your mind. you have nothing in your mind. Pensive means like serious, a bit moody. So he's saying like very often when I sit on my sofa and I'm in this slightly moody mood and there's nothing in my mind, then the daffodils suddenly come to my mind. They suddenly flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. So this inward eye, it's like a special eye where even though he's just sitting alone on his sofa, he can suddenly see the daffodils come up in his mind again. All right, so that's his imagination. And that, he tells us, is the bliss of solitude, the joy of being alone when your imagination can call up this beautiful memory. And then, when that happens, his heart fills with pleasure and his heart also dances with the daffodils. Okay, so to summarize everything, this poem is basically a persona or speaker telling us about how he saw this beautiful sight one day and it made him feel so happy even though he was alone. And at that time, he didn't realize it, but it brought him so much of value. And even now, very often when he's sitting alone at home, in a serious mood, suddenly this beautiful view comes to his mind again and gives him so much joy. Okay? So what are the themes of this poem? Of course, there are many things that we could say, but I'm just going to highlight 3 simple themes. The first one, obviously, is nature. This poem is all about celebrating nature, how beautiful it is, how it can fill your heart with joy even when you're alone. It celebrates how vast, how vibrant, how beautiful nature is. And there's so many words, phrases that show us that. Secondly, it also explores the theme of solitude or loneliness. You might be wondering what's the difference between these 2 words. Solitude has a more positive connotation and it's normally used to describe people who enjoy being alone, whereas loneliness is usually used to describe it when you don't feel happy because there's no one else around you and you don't really want to be alone. But essentially they mean the same thing. And one of the things that this poem explores is the experience of being alone, and it shows us that the poet actually enjoys being alone. He enjoys the spiritual space of being alone to enjoy nature and be with his own imagination. And that brings us to the third theme, which is imagination. You know, the poem is actually based on the poet being alone at home. You know, it's actually kind of a memory. He's telling us about a time when he saw this beautiful sight, but actually the poem ends on a note of him being alone at home, but it's because of his imagination that he's able to, you know, enjoy himself at home and not feel sad, and in fact he feels happy. And I think maybe we can relate to that. Some of us enjoy being alone, and when our imagination goes wild, we come up with stories. We like to read storybooks. We like to listen to music. We like to build things, create things, and imagine all kinds of really interesting things. Okay, so now that we've talked about the themes, let's talk about some literary devices, the ones that are most prominent in this poem. Of course, there are so many literary devices and we can talk about it forever, but let's just highlight some of the most important and striking ones in this poem. So there are a few that we have to talk about together, and those are basically imagery, personification, and simile. Okay, so this poem is full of images, full of really beautiful images, and the imagery is central to the poet's presentation of how beautiful, how amazing nature is. Okay, so the imagery is also personification and simile. It works together hand in hand. So let's talk about personification. Of course, the most striking thing about this poem is actually the poet's personification of the daffodils. So he describes these flowers and he describes them as if they are people. He describes them as so energetic, so vibrant, so beautiful, and he uses words like a crowd to describe them. He talks about how they were dancing, how they were tossing their heads, and he describes them as jocund company. So he's basically personifying them as if they have human attributes and as if they are able to accompany him at this point in time, and they are really beautiful, and they are basically the star of the show in this poem. He also personifies the waves. Okay, but he only does it a little bit, basically to compare the waves to the daffodils and say that, you know, the daffodils are better, but the waves also danced, right? So that's that personification. Apart from that, there are lots of beautiful images in this poem. So here is a simile. I wandered lonely as a cloud, right? So he's comparing himself to a cloud. And again, that's another image of nature, bringing to mind the beauty of nature. And I think one last image I want to highlight, which is really striking in this poem, is how he compares the daffodils to the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. So this is a simile as well as an image, right? He's comparing the daffodils to the stars. And I think that by comparing these two very different images of nature, it brings to mind several things. So when you think of stars, you think of how they are really heavenly, they are really powerful and bright, and, you know, quite hard to understand actually. They are really vast and really, in a way, mystical. So by comparing the daffodils to the stars, he amplifies the beauty of the daffodils and makes us think, yeah, they're so vast, so beautiful. Okay, so we've talked a lot about imagery as well as personification and simile, and these are, you know, basically the central literary devices of this poem. One last one that I want to highlight is the use of rhyme scheme. Okay, so what is the rhyme scheme of this poem? It's basically A, B, A, B, C, C. All right, and I think that this C, C at the end, we call these rhyming couplets. So every stanza ends with a rhyming couplet, and I think that is really poetic and beautiful. It gives a certain closure to each stanza, and particularly in the last stanza when he says, "And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils." So that perfect end rhyme, which makes a rhyming couplet between fills and daffodils, and that repetition of daffodils. I think the poet uses the rhyme scheme to create this sense of beauty and completion in the poem, a sense of balance. When you think about the rhyme scheme, everything is very balanced. It's A, B, and then A, B. So you've got two alternating end rhymes, and then you've got this rhyming couplet here. Okay, so now that we've understood the poem, I want to ask you, have you ever been amazed by the beauty and splendor of nature? Maybe it was a waterfall, a sunset, maybe it was I don't know, something in your garden. So I want to ask you to think of that. Stop and pull up that memory in your mind. What did you feel and think at that moment? Can you remember what you saw, what you heard, what you smelled, what you felt? And a second question to ask you, is, do you enjoy being in nature alone? I think some people do. Some people enjoy going for walks, going hiking, even going fishing. Some people don't, right? And yeah, I guess I would ask you why or why not. Here are some sample questions that are based on the exam format. So in your exam, you'll have to answer 2 questions on 2 different poems. So, sorry, 1 question for each poem and 2 questions in total. And you have 40 minutes to answer these 2 questions, so that's 20 minutes per question, and the poem will be printed out for you. So this first question is actually given by the KPM Lembaga Peperiksaan themselves as a sample question. How does Wordsworth convey nature's ability to comfort one in times of loneliness? This second question here is based on a statement. So sometimes the questions are based on a statement, like being alone can bring great delight. Discuss this statement with close reference to the poem above. So here are some questions that you can try out. If you want me to make a video discussing the question, let me know. So that is all for the video lesson today on Daffodils by William Wordsworth. We covered a little bit about the author's background, the meaning of the poem, some of the key themes, literary devices, and I also gave you a couple of sample questions to think about. If you've got any questions, do leave a comment down below. If you liked this video and found it helpful, do subscribe to this YouTube channel, Monty Literature, and you can also find me on Facebook. I'd love to hear from you, so do feel free to get in touch. So yeah, that's all for today. Take care and stay safe.